part of the broadcast tonight. Looking forward to studying Isaiah chapter 2 through chapter 4 with you tonight. I need a couple of things. If you're online, I just need you to watch a couple of things for me. I noticed last week I was watching through YouTube while Jeff was teaching, and the audio and the video was a little bit out of sync on my TV, but some other people said it was on sync with them, and when I watched the replay, it was on sync as well. So if you're watching, especially if you're watching on YouTube tonight, if you see a difference between, if the audio is not synced up, please send me a message and let me know. You can put it on Facebook, YouTube, send me a text, send me an email. Just let me know. I'm just trying to make sure all of that is working properly. So the first thing I want to do tonight is remind you about Trail of Treats. So Trail of Treats is coming up October the 30th. It is from 6 to 8 p.m. We are at 5444 Highway 41A, Joelton, Tennessee. If you are in that area, we want to invite you to Trail of Treats. We have a trail through the woods. Why it's called Trail of Treats, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? But we have a trail through the woods, and we light it. It's lit with lanterns, and you go from table to table as you trick-or-treat. But if you're out trick-or-treating on Saturday, October the 30th from 6 to 8, we would love to have you stop by Clarksville Highway and just let us meet you, see your costume, just say hi. And you get candy, we get to say hi. We'll feed you a hot dog. So everybody wins with that. So Trail of Treats, if you don't have kids or you don't go trick-or-treating, make sure that you let somebody know. Just call people that you know that live in our area, invite them to Trail of Treats. I just really enjoy that being every year. Looking forward to it, and hope we have a really big crowd. I mean, it's the night before Halloween, so I think maybe a lot of people will be trick-or-treating on that Saturday night, and hopefully we will have a huge crowd that shows up for that. A couple of other things, just make sure that the audio is loud enough. The way I've got things arranged, kind of put the mic over here, but if the audio is not loud enough, let me know, and we'll try to make. So I hope you have a Bible with you, and I will show the text on the screen, so you don't have to worry about that. But it's always good if you can have down and read your own text. I mean, I have that on the screen. Also have my handy dandy Bible here, so you can hear that. So hang on. Okay, so don't have any. It's usually from somebody important. So just really enjoy that every year. Looking forward to it. Let me send that back. Okay, so it sounds like we have an echo somewhere. So hang on just a second. Let me see if I can fix that. All right, sorry about the echo. That should take care of the echo. And so I have 4 or 5 different screens open at one time, and if I leave the audio on there, it echoes a little bit, and I can't hear that. So thank you for letting me know there's an echo, and hopefully that helped. In the next 2 or 3 minutes, if there is a still echo, send that to me again, but I think that probably fixed the echo. So anyway, I hope you have a Bible with you. It's always good to sit down and read the text. And hopefully after looking at Isaiah chapter 2 through 4 tonight, you'll go back and reread that and look at all of that and make sure that that is okay. So anyway, please again, if you have a problem with that, let me know. If the echo does not go away, somebody send me a message. I'm sure the same wonderful person who sent me that message will send me another one if the echo persists. But again, I think the echo should be taken care of. All right, so Isaiah chapter 2, and so we're going to cover basically a couple of things tonight. So there are 4 main points that I want to cover. The second is our goal. The third is our obstacles to reaching that goal. And the fourth is the reality, and that's God's reality. And it's kind of an interesting, so it's kind of a really, echo's gone, so that's good. So it's kind of a really interesting section of Scripture, and it's also very challenging. Now remember, we are talking about God being sovereign through the chaos. And one of the things that happens in Isaiah chapter 2 through 4, God is going to talk about the judgment that needs to come against his people. But it's interesting because they're in a time of existence, and if you looked at their circumstances, you would think that everything's going well. But things might be going well on the outside. They might be blessed. They might have lots of things, just aren't going well. And I think it's a challenge for us sometimes, because sometimes we get this idea that if everything is going good on the out, a lot of problems, or life seems to be going great. So if that's happening, that's with us, or God's upset with us. And that's not the case at all. And you'll see Isaiah chapter 2 and verses 1 through 5. And this is a description of the mountain of the Lord. And this is a prophetic type of description. This is not reality yet, but God is saying this is what's coming for my people. The word that Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. And remember, Isaiah's prophecy is about Judah and Jerusalem. He's going to have some prophecies about some other nations. We'll kind of touch on those as we go through, but we're not covering the whole book verse by verse, okay? So, verse 2. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and it shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many peoples shall come and say, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations. He shall decide disputes for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. O house of Jacob, come let us walk in the light of the Lord. Isn't that a great description of, don't you really long to live in that world where nation's not fighting against nation and everybody's getting along and there's no war or bloodshed, and God decides the disputes. And God says in a very prophetic way, that is what's coming to the world. And that is coming to the world. It's still coming to the world. But when they heard that, when that original audience heard that, they might have thought that it was about them at that time, or that it was something that was just getting ready to occur. Because if you think about that, to the people who it was originally written to, things are going so well that they might think, okay, in God's prophecy there, what he's saying is that before long, we are going to be the head of the nations. Everyone is going to come to us. Jerusalem's going to be lifted up, and everything's going to be going well. Now, there's some reasons they would have thought that. You know, the first is about Uzziah. Remember, the prophecy of Isaiah is during the time of Uzziah and Jotham, of the first two kings that are listed. And let me move this so I can get over here. So, this is a verse about Uzziah. He set himself to seek God in the days of Zechariah, who instructed him in the fear of God, and as long as he sought the Lord, God made him prosper. And as God made Uzziah prosper, the nation, it expanded. I mean, the enemies were subdued. Lands in the Philistines were captured. Other nations were bringing tribute to Uzziah, and also to Jotham after him, his son, and everything was going great. And so then Jotham comes to the throne, and it says about Jotham. Now, just very quickly before we move on, I almost forgot something. As long as he sought the Lord, and remember, Uzziah in his pride tried to offer a sacrifice. He tried to do something in the temple he wasn't supposed to do, and he was struck with leprosy. So Jotham, his son, kind of co-reigned with him. But it said about Jotham, so Jotham became mighty because he ordered his ways before the Lord his God. So Uzziah and Jotham are both godly kings. They're seeking God. God's blessing the nation. I mean, Uzziah and Jotham have this huge army, and they're protected from their enemies. They're expanding the territory. Other nations are bringing them tribute, and they have all of these things. Everything is going well. And in their prosperity, the people might have thought that Isaiah was talking about the near future in Isaiah chapter 2. But there was something wrong. Even though there was plenty of money and plenty of stuff, something was missing. And as he concludes that in chapter 2, verse 5, he kind of highlights our goal. Remember, the first thing that we were talking about is God's vision and God's goal. And God's goal, let's go back to the slide real quick. God's plan is that he is bringing redemption to his people. And our goal is to walk in the way of God. I mean, kind of the center verse in some of this about what our goal is Isaiah chapter 2, verse 5. O house of Jacob, come let us walk in the light of the Lord. Now, that's exactly what we want to do through Jesus. We want to walk in the light of the Lord. In other words, wherever God is leading, that's where we want to go. Whatever God says is holy and righteous and good, those are the things that we want to do. Whatever God says is evil and we should stay away from and is sin, those are the things that we want to avoid. We want to stay away from. And the reason for that, I think, is the commandments of God usually reflect the nature of God. So as we follow God's commandments, we become more like his nature. Why is it wrong to lie? Because God can't lie. So we're trying to follow the nature of God, and the commandments help us do that. So the commandments are good and holy, but we are unholy in that we break the commandments. So that's a different subject. We get into another time. But our goal is to walk in the light of the Lord, to walk down God's path and to honor God with everything that we do and everything that we say and every action that we have. So God has a plan, which is the redemption of his people. We have a goal, which is to walk in the light of God, to walk in the path of God, to be pleasing to God. But then we run into this incredible problem. And that's what you run into in Isaiah chapter 2 through chapter 4. First, God says, this is my vision. This is what I am going to do. And it's going to happen because God has determined that it's going to happen. It wasn't up to the people to make it happen. God is going to make that happen. So these latter days in the mountain, the house of the Lord, and just through the church and the redemption of Jesus, and even for us, the redemption of our bodies through the resurrection and the new heaven and the new earth, where nation doesn't lift up sword against nation. But there's a problem. And the problem comes from us. It comes from our obstacles. And from chapter 2, verse 6 through chapter 4, verse 1, God is telling his people what's wrong. Because if you look at chapter 2, verse 6, get me off the screen. For you have rejected your people, the house of Jacob, because they are full of things from the east and of fortune tellers like the Philistines. And then he goes on with a long list of those. Let me just come back and bring the text back up, starting with that verse. For you have rejected your people, the house of Jacob, because they are full of things from the east and of fortune tellers like the Philistines, and they strike hands with the children of foreigners. And that's just one of the things that he talks about when he talks about the things that have happened with the Israelites. We're going to kind of go through this list. Again, you need to read Isaiah chapter 2, 3, and 4 so that you can go back and read that and see some of the things that we're talking about. We can't read all of that stuff while we're online, so you need to follow along with that. So here's what's happening. Here are the obstacles that they're facing, and these become our obstacles. And the first one is, I just simply titled it as influence. It's the influence of the world. It's the influence of those around us. If you go back to the text very quickly, he said, they are full of things from the east. For example, they're fortune tellers like the Philistines, and they strike hands with the children of foreigners. That means they're uh, they do similar things with them. They're in alliances with them, or they've adopted their behavior, or they've adopted what they consider to be religious, or maybe they're worshiping another god, which we'll look at in a few minutes. But they strike hands with the children of foreigners. They're full of things from the east. In other words, ungodly influences have come in, and those ungodly influences are beginning to change the hearts and the lives of the people, so that instead of being pleasing to God, they become unpleasing to God. And I think it's fair to say, and to work on making these slides, you can see them when I'm on a slide. I have to make myself smaller maybe. But the world's attraction is very critical in alienating us from God. The world's attraction alienates from God, and it can alienate from God. You see that reflected in New Testament verses sometimes. For example, in 1 John, John writes, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever." So when you think about that and that chaos, sorry, wrong button. And you think about that chaos, one of the things that happens is we're living in a world that might be full of chaos, but it doesn't maybe look like it's full of chaos. And you start looking around at the things of the world, and all of a sudden the things of the world become attractive. So they were looking at the Philistines, or they were looking at the other foreigners, or they were looking at another god, or they were looking at an idol. And all of a sudden, those things don't seem nearly as bad as they seemed before, or they're influenced by those things. And it makes me wonder, you look at the Israelites, and they're influenced by the world around them. Now remember that God's kingdom now is not geographical. God's kingdom is not a geographical place. God's kingdom is reflected in the church, and the church exists in the hearts and the lives of people. So it's not like as if we're looking at the kingdom of God now as a geographical section. The kingdom of God is all over the world. But it leads us to a question, and that is, how can kingdom people be full of things from the east? Or how can kingdom people be full of things from the world? And if we become very honest with ourselves, it's very easy to see that, isn't it? Just noticed on the chat box that you were telling me that the music was, but we got that worked out. Even in God's church, it's easy for the world to have an influence. It's easy for us to get out of sync with God. It's easy for us to get out of step with the Spirit. It's easy for us to become distracted by all of the things in the world, and then start looking at the things in the world as if that's the way to do things. For example, the world says that power is the place to be, but yet Jesus comes along and says, no, it's not power, it's service. The world, we look at things and say, well, it's just about what you do. But then Jesus comes along and he says, no, it's not just about what you do, it's about what you think and what you plan. And it's not just about an action, it's about an attitude of the heart. The world comes along and says, money is a really important thing, but then God comes along and says, well, you have to be really careful about money, because money can lead you away from me. And that kind of gets us to our second point, and that is one of the obstacles that we have in our way, and one of the obstacles that the Israelites had in their way, those living in Judah and Jerusalem here, was prosperity. I mean, they had lots of stuff. Now, if you go back and look at the text, their land is filled with silver and gold. There is no end to their treasure. Their land is filled with horses. There is no end to their chariots. When you look over a couple of down into chapter 3, it talks about the things that God is going to take away from them. But at the end of chapter 3, he talks about the finery of the anklets and the headbands and the crescents and the pennants and the bracelets and the scarves. He's talking about the women, the headdresses, the armlets, the sashes, the perfume boxes, and the amulets and the signet rings and the nose rings and the festal robes and the mantles and the cloaks and the handbags and the mirrors, the linen garments, the turbans and the veils. All of those things that were reflections of the immense wealth that they had in their world. And as we think about God being sovereign in chaos, I think one of the things that we probably recognize in that is in their world, even though there's chaos, it doesn't look like chaos. It looks like order. It looks like things are going well. And then we have this limit of prosperity, and all of a sudden it's the prosperity that is leading them away from God. You know, it reminds me of something Jesus said in the New Testament. And to me, I think this is a very haunting verse. Truly I say to you, only with difficulty will a rich person enter the kingdom of heaven. Only with difficulty will a rich person enter the kingdom of heaven, because in our riches and in our prosperity, we tend not to trust in God, but we tend to change that. That prosperity can lead to this pride and self-reliance, this idea that we can do things on our own, or that we don't need God, or we have the ability to take care of all of things as we immerse ourselves in all of the possessions and in all of the treasures. You know, I love it when it says in Isaiah, there's no end to their treasures. And I'm just talking about my community and where I live, and we can become so prosperous, which is a blessing of God, but that blessing of God can lead us away from God if we're not careful and if we don't manage that well. And so so prosperity can begin to lead us away from God. And we'll come back to that in just a second. You know, the other thing it says in the text is their land is filled with idols. And you think, well, how in the world did that happen? I mean, you have these verses like verse 8, their land is filled with idols. They bow down to the work of their hands, to what their fingers have made. Later, when it talks about the judgment of God, he says, and the idol, I was going to try to highlight that for you, the idols shall utterly pass away. And he says about the individuals, in that day mankind will cast away their idols of silver and their idols of gold, which they made for themselves to worship, to the moles and to the bats. And then they'll enter the caverns as they try to hide from the judgment of God that's coming on the world. So their land is full of idols. And you wonder, how did that happen? How did they become so full of idols? Because God is blessing them. You got a godly king, and you've got a large military force. You have other nations paying tribute. Money is flowing freely. You have many possessions. You have lots of things. But then they forget that the one who provided all of those gifts to them was God. And so they're off worshiping other idols. And remember, they were full of things from the east, and some of the things from the east they had began to worship the gods from the other nations, just as God told them that they would if they didn't drive them out, like he said back in the book of Deuteronomy. So you have you have those things going on. But when you look at our world, would we really be any different? I mean, in a lot of ways we have prosperity. But do remember, it's God that granted us the prosperity, and we continue to give thanks to Him and worship Him. You say, well, we don't have idols sitting up on our mantles, do we? Well, mostly not, but we have our own set of idols, don't we? Those things that turn our attention away from God, those things that we lift up more than God, or those things that become greater than God to us. And so we also deal with those same types of obstacles, and so the idols that we have, or that we say that we don't have, maybe the greatest idol is ego. In all honesty, maybe the greatest idol is not money or possessions or a boat or a car or a motorcycle or a house, or maybe it's not a relationship, maybe it's not a wife or a son or a daughter or a husband. maybe the greatest idol is ego. Just the fact that we are so centered on ourselves, and we so desperately want the things that we want that we turn our eyes away from God. And so our ego leads to something else, and it leads to a rebellious kind of sin. And I know most of us would say, well, we don't really ever have rebellious sin. But we do have rebellious sin sometimes when we know what we should do, and we don't do it, or we know what we're doing is wrong and we continue to do it anyway. And in Isaiah chapter 3 verse 9, God says it's this way. He says, "For the look on their faces bear witness against them. They proclaim their sin like Sodom. They do not hide it." In other words, they had gotten so brazen about their sin that they didn't even try to hide it anymore. It was just out in the open. It reminds me of 1 Corinthians 15 and the man who was living in a sexually immoral relationship. And Paul calls that out to the church and says, look, you need to deal with that. You need to talk about that. You need to deal with that rebellion that's within the church. And so here they have just such a blatant disregard for God's will that they don't even try to hide their sin from anyone anymore. And it's mankind can easily justify his actions to hide the rebellion from himself. And we do this. We say, well, it's really not my fault. Or if God really knew what was going on, he wouldn't tell me not to do that. Or we'll even justify our rebellion through grace, saying, well, it's okay. I know it's wrong to do it, but I'm going to do it anyway, because when I do it, God will forgive me. So since I know I'm going to get forgiven, I'll go ahead and do the thing that I know that I'm not supposed to do, which is a type of rebellion against God. So and we're really good at justifying our actions to do the things that we want to do, because again, I think the greatest idol is ego. And so we have these obstacles just like they had. I mean, you look at their world and it looks like things are going great, but their hearts aren't anywhere dedicated to serving God. Their hearts are far from God, and God is getting ready to bring judgment on them. So God, it's just kind of a key verse in Isaiah 2:22. He says, "Stop regarding man, in whose nostrils is breath, for what account is he?" Who is man? Man's a created being. We were created with a purpose. The purpose is to honor God. We don't control our own destinies. We don't control all the things that are around us. We can't control the circumstances that surround us. We can't make the sun shine. We can't make the grass grow. We can't make the trees bloom. We can't even provide for ourselves. Even the very air that we breathe, we can't create that. I mean, it is just, all of that is by the hand of God. And so God is saying, don't lose focus on who I am. Things are going well, but not spiritually. And in our lives, things can go physically well, but not go spiritually well. Things can look like they're very ordered, but they can be full of chaos. So I know we did chapter 2 through chapter 4 was man's sin, because man's sin is and our obstacles are the thread kind of runs through all of those verses. But in Isaiah chapter 3 and chapter 4, God is talking about the judgment that is going to come upon the people. So because of their haughtiness, because of their pride, then God is going to bring judgment on them. And the way he does that is just a neat thing to look at. For behold, the Lord, the God of hosts, is taking away from Jerusalem. Okay, all of these things that I've given you, I'm going to take those things away. Support and supply, bread and water. The mighty soldier, the judge, the prophet, the elder, the diviner, the captains of the army, the counselors, the skillful men, all of the things that you have, I'm going to take those away so that you will return and you will follow me again. And then There's a couple of places in there where it says that God is taking things away, and and when you look at that judgment that's coming, the reason the judgment is coming is because they have forgotten who God is. They have forgotten that God is the one who supplies and gives all of the things that they have. And I want to look and make sure I wasn't missing something on my notes there. I don't have very many notes, but so we end up with this self-trust. And the way that God has to work with us, it's like the discipline that God talks about in the New Testament. Sometimes discipline is a good thing, and this is a form of discipline where God is going to bring them back. He's going to take away some of the things that he has blessed them with so greatly, because in their prosperity, they've turned away from God. And I think we have to be very careful that in our prosperity, when things look like it's in order and everything's going well, that we don't turn our backs and turn away from who God is. So, but the reality that God has is in chapter 4, verses 2 through 6. And it's about the branch of the Lord. And I want us to read this. I won't take but just a second. Chapter 4, verse 2. In that day the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and honor of the survivors of Israel. And he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, everyone who has been recorded for life in Jerusalem. When the Lord shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and cleansed the bloodstains of Jerusalem from its midst by a spirit of judgment and by a spirit of burning. Then the Lord will create over the whole site of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day, and smoke and the shining of a flaming fire by night. Over all the glory there will be a canopy. There will be a booth for shade by day from the heat, and for refuge and a shelter from the storm and the rain. You know, it's really incredible the way that God started this section. He ends the section. Oh, the mountain of the Lord. And then the branch of the Lord is going to be glorified. So in the middle of this judgment, it is created in both of these. It's sandwiched between these blessings that God is going to give to his people. And the reality of that is, in all things, God is going to be glorified. In Isaiah chapter 2, verse 11, he says, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. So what is man that has the breath of the breath in his nostrils? Well, the Lord alone is going to be exalted when his judgment comes, and people, that kings are taken from their positions of authority, and haughty people are brought low, and prideful people are humbled. Then God will be exalted in that day, because all will turn to God into his kingdom. And so in God's reality, and this is such a beautiful part of this section of Scripture, it's a beautiful part of Isaiah if you look for it as you read through the book. The incredible thing is, in God's judgment, God grants rescue. So it's not as if God is going to come in judgment in the world and not give an opportunity or a place for rescue. Yes, God's going to come in judgment, but God is watching over his people and caring for his people. And even in their punishment, God is coming to rescue. Sometimes in the text we call this the day of the Lord, when the day of the Lord comes. And that's what he's talking about here. He even uses that phrase, the day of the Lord. And the day of the Lord can either be a great day, I mean, it can be a wonderful day because you are, by faith in Jesus, you are in perfect harmony with God, and your sins are forgiven, and you're righteous and holy. Not because you've earned the way to be righteous and holy, but because Jesus has pronounced you righteous and holy. He is the one who has made you righteous and holy. So in that day, when God comes in judgment and God says, hey, blessed are you, my servant, here's the kingdom that's prepared for you. So in that way, judgment is a great day because judgment brings refuge. But he says to the haughty and to the proud, to those who won't trust in him, to those who turn away, he says there is a judgment coming in the world because of that. And as you look at those, you look at those concepts, we really go back to where we started. So God is sovereign in the chaos, even in the chaos of the world that's happening now. You know, I think we have to be very careful, those things that we covered. You know, listen for God's plan. Look at God's plan. Look at what God is doing for the world through the church. And the church is God's eternal plan for this world. So look at what God is doing in the church, how He can bring redemption and peace and kindness and joy and rescue from suffering and victory over death, all through Jesus and the church. And so in all of that chaos, all of the things that are happening, all of the things that, if you start listening to the news every day, or you start trying to figure out why the world operates the way that the world operates, or you start looking at the injustice and the oppression in the world. And that's one of the things that he says in Isaiah chapter 2. I mean, you're mistreating the poor, you're rubbing their faces in the dirt. It's kind of the way he says it in Isaiah. So in all of that chaos, there is this rescue that comes through God and the church, because God is never out of touch with the world that He has put into place. So recognize God's plan in the world, and go back to that key verse. It's in Isaiah chapter 2. I'll try to see if I can get it back on the screen for you right here. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. And make that your goal, to walk in the light of the Lord. And those obstacles that we talked about, recognize those obstacles in your life and try to overcome those obstacles in your life, and let God reign through the chaos. Hey, hope you've enjoyed tuning in tonight. I'm trying to keep these to around 30 minutes or so. If I can do that. You probably don't want me to talk longer than that. Anyway, a Sunday morning, we would be doing the sermon Sunday morning is the panoply of God. Most of us have sung about the panoply of God in a song that we usually, that's kind of a traditional song that we sang. I think we still know it anyway. But anyway, we're going to talk about the panoply of God. How do you put it on? And how do you use it? And the panoply, by the way, is what we call the full armor of God. So how do you put the full armor of God on? And more importantly, not what is it, but how do you use it? And how does it protect you? And how does it make itself present in your life? The question that I was asked is, how do we put on the full armor of God? So that's what we're going to talk about. Last week, if you didn't get a chance to listen to that, we talked about the forces of evil in the heavenly places. We cannot defeat Satan without the armor of God. We cannot do it ourselves. So we need God's armor around us. So we're going to talk about that Sunday morning. Looking forward to that. Again, mark your calendars for Trail of Treats so that you can be present for that. I don't see any questions on any of these. So I am assuming from that we do not have any questions. So since we don't have any questions, I hope you have a great evening, and thanks for tuning in, and look forward to studying with you next week. Next week will actually be Jeff Henry. Jeff will teach next Wednesday and the Wednesday after that, and then I'll be back for a couple of Wednesdays after that. So thanks, Jeff, for doing that, and please tune in, and also tune in Sunday morning to listen to our class.